Yes.
I'm going to go get some green coffee.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So 3 other people
Right.
have different tastes somehow.
Yeah. So we'll start in about 6 minutes. Or maybe
Awesome.
7.
Okay.
Which will be right on time. So that's be good.
Well, that's a choice she has to make. I don't think she will. Yes, so, yeah, Janice knows that. So
It's supposed to be beautiful.
Janice has not announced what she's gonna do.
And Iowa's got a baseball game at 2 o'clock
What
also.
she's gonna do.
Wow.
Is that where you're running off to after this?
Possibly, yes.
I went to one last week, so.
You what?
I went to one last week, so.
How did they do?
We won. It was the Rutgers game,
Okay.
the doubleheader.
Oh, okay. I don't even know who they're playing. My husband's a huge White Sox fan.
Oh,
And he has said for years and years, he's like, we just need to go out and watch Iowa play a game, because they were really good last year, right?
yeah.
Yeah, they were really good last year, right? Okay, so he was like, we need to make sure we get out there.
I'll kind of have to hate your husband because I'm a Cubs fan.
Oh, dang, well, I'll hate you back,
Okay. Well, I mean, it's only fair.
right?
I haven't met her, I guess, but I don't know.
It's not like they got a
Think of brontosaurus.
Okay.
Brontos.
How do you spell it?
B-R-O.
Okay.
Well, if you went to fancy
A lot of things are
Yeah, well,
trying
it's just really
I
nice.
feel like if you think of a brontosaurus,
Yeah.
get in there.
No, that's good.
I'm not offended.
Like, so
I made her go get the fancy creamer, so if I don't,
And
then
she said use it as an open season.
I know, I
All right, if you're not going to party at the table.
I am not going to the table, I'm sorry.
What's your name?
Party of a banana.
So, yeah, that's better.
Well, coming to through. Carol,
You just put some
Well,
effort
Carol,
or
we're-
whatever.
Mother of Zoe, who we were on the panel last time.
Yeah, my name is.
Yeah, that's a- that's a good approach.
So, you feel like,
She now knows more than she
So I'm
yet
like-
know about punctuation.
no, actually,
any questions? Look, okay, does anybody have any problems with any questions?
my coffee.
no, you're
That was
totally.
question number 5.
I'm an enemy.
All right.
I'll do that.
Your
You know,
banana.
I'm just gonna answer the way that I understood.
Yeah,
the
no, that's
question.
fine. That's fine.
Yeah, just like, I feel like maybe my answer is not gonna have like really win with the way that I feel.
I trained for this all my life.
What home is.
Yeah, lifting chairs. and
Yeah, I
all
worked
that.
in a furniture store.
Oh.
My family all works in furniture, so.
I want to be like a host and just make sure that everybody's.
I found a recipe for those with all of the.
Nice.
I think
Good.
it's like
Okay,
a
further
or
question,
something.
good to go.
Okay.
Anyways,
In black and white?
yeah. It was surprising to see. But anyways, I did it. You won't. In the class, it's there.
Very odd.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Is that allergy throat?
2 cents.
Do I have allergies? Am I sounding?
You sounded a little hoarse.
Do I? Man.
do some vocal work.
I had like 4 conversations yesterday, and I tell you, it's just taxing.
I see, okay.
Like talking to human beings like 4 different times.
When you're supposed to be writing right now.
I know.
And what is she doing? And that one?
I don't think it's allergies.
She's a student at the
I think it just might be,
Talking.
it might just be that. Yeah. Or just like, I don't know. Maybe I'm not used to speaking before noon. Like I have my,
Yes, it could be.
my vow of
I
silence,
just
and
met
so
some
it's
people
just,
that, like, some student at the University of Iowa. One of them, she said, that's her name, and she will.
And is this the beard project resuming?
oh no, this is gonna stay here. I'm gonna keep it trim for a year.
That's a different type of discipline.
It is. You know, I'm just expanding all quadrants of visual functionality.
It's good to have options.
Well, yeah. It's liberating to have options, as long as you only have one at a time. Otherwise, you're immersed in a paralysis of indecision.
See, if you'd worked in sales, you'd already know that.
Only give one option?
Only give 3 options.
Only give 3
So you
options.
need like a sort of low, high, and middling, and the middling is usually the most attractive. Yeah.
So is this middling? Are you calling my beard middling?
Yeah, because if the options are really full, you're exactly
This is a
right.
middling, yeah.
This is the trimmed middle.
It's just right, in the words of the 3 bears.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
It could be the high maintenance option though, it might be the.
Yeah, I think that's a higher maintenance option.
This is a little more forgiving than clean shaving. Like clean shaving, I'm like, man, I gotta shave every day. What a burden. What a burden on my life.
Oh, heart goes out to all men. Special hand.
Oh, why is there music?
Whoa.
That was unexpected. I don't even know where that's coming from.
It's coming from your iPad, I think.
Oh, it just auto-generates, that's not. Okay, well that won't.
I'm gonna refill my coffee and then I think like we'll have like 1 or 2 more minutes for stragglers.
Sure, yeah.
And then
We could do it some music then, maybe.
straggling music. Is that like straggle rock?
Is that like crap?
Straggle rock is where like the leftover puppets went. That's what they're
Struggle
doing.
rock? Yeah.
Struggle rock.
Hey, we're on TV. PATV.
Yeah.
That's the wrap.
Live stream it, and then my kids are 6 years old.
All right. My pleasure. I know it's ours taking
Yeah.
too much. Two paragraphs that I could do.
We are on TV.
Third survey. To look at this how's your semester going?
It's going, 2 more weeks. We were out at so many days of class, I feel like I don't know the students as well as
You just don't slow down, do you?
Yes.
So excited. Are you on semester schedule still?
SAC.
It's a broad.
And then
Well, my wife Barbara is,
Yeah.
and our daughters are used to
but also excited about
She's doing neuroscience, is that what
psychology and brain sciences. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's been working for a research team for 2 years.
Here?
Yeah, but she's not going to be a research scientist. Her minor is sociology. She's really interested in social psychology.
Should we close the doors? Because there are people that come through.
People are gonna come through. Yeah, I think we're okay. So just
Okay.
see the doors open.
Okay.
Okay.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
All right.
One of the most interesting council candidate forums I ever participated in was held over at Old Capitol Building. It was held in that interior space. So people would be walking around. There were a lot of people in the audience, but others would just walk by and what's going on here? And other people standing up there and second
All right.
floor looking down.
That's good.
Is everyone ready?
We're ready to go home.
Are you ready? Are you ready? Oh man, I should get ready. All right. Let's ready. Yeah. All right. Welcome to the UI Stanley Museum of Art's collaboration with Coffee with Dan and the UI Theme Semester on American Dreams. We'd like to thank Merge for hosting us today, as well as the Office of Outreach and Engagement and the Overman Center for sponsoring today's panel. Home has always been central to human dreams. Whether it takes the form of nostalgia and the dream of returning to a home that one has left, or the ability to claim land and build something in the future, humans tend to have an uncanny, unsettled way of connecting home and dream. In Iowa City, our way of relating is culturally contextualized by the relationship of home ownership to the American dream, stretching from westward expansion and manifest destiny in the 19th century to planting subdivisions in former fields throughout the corridor today as a way to satisfy the longing to make yourself at home here. Today is the second of 3 conversations that will connect the topics of home, dream, and Iowa City. Our final conversation will be held on May 18th, also here at Merge. In that conversation, we will explore the question of when will we get home and do an analysis of the future potential of homemaking in this particular area. But for today, we will focus on what it means to make home here and now. The question of homemaking is a task that is complicated by a variety of factors that hit to the heart of human existence: economics, gender, race, culture. Our hope today is to thoughtfully explore through the cracks and crevices that occlude the heart of a home and to expose some of the heartbreaking elements that come when complications to homemaking, wholly external to the home, end up making homemaking an impossibility. I did that on purpose, the making, homemaking. It sounded better in my head than it did.
It's complicated.
All right. The format for today will be as follows. First, Vera Smith, the Associate Curator of the Legacies for Iowa Collections Sharing Project for the University of Iowa's Stanley Museum of Art, which is a really long
It's
title.
a really long title.
We'll look at some art and artifacts related to home from her collection, or the university's collection, not hers.
Could be.
Could be yours. I then will have a series of conversations with our 4 panelists for today, one at a time, before we take questions from those of you who are present, and follow with a general discussion about what home has meant in Iowa City over the years. So, with that,
Sure.
go ahead.
I'm Vera Rose Smith. I'm the Associate Curator of the Legacies for Iowa Collection Sharing Project at the Stanley Museum of Art. You needed to hear my title twice. And this conversation series is an outgrowth of an exhibition we staged at the Figge Museum of Art that had to do with ideas of home across time and culture. And so I've brought on this iPad that I'll pass around a couple of images that were included in this show. And these 3 objects speak more to what happens when home doesn't feel like a safe place. One is sort of just conjecture on my part. It is, and I'll show it and then I'll pass it. This is a large-scale painting by abstract expressionist Theodoros Stamos, who was a Greek-American artist. He was working around the same time as many other famous abstract expressionists in New York. And this work is called Screen Door, and I'll just pass this down actually, and you can flip through if you'd like. So it's kind of hard to see anything that looks like a door or a screen, but when I look at this image, I read a figure staring into an abyss. And this is actually a nostalgic image for me in many ways. I grew up in the middle of nowhere in rural Illinois, and there is a screen door in my parents' house that this image relates to me very personally. And that screen door overlooks the woods beyond my parents' home where it was always dark and rustling, and I never knew quite what was out there. But I think there's also sort of a menacing presence. There's this blackness beyond the thing that I'm reading as a figure, which is a large red swath near the center of the work. So I brought that in just because I think it can be read in multiple ways. The unknowing of what's beyond home, the unknowing of what's inside of home. We don't know which side this potential figure is standing on the door. The other images that are included are a black and white photograph from Andy Warhol. We have a large collection of these photographs. These were not necessarily meant to be displayed. They were taken, I'm sure Andrew knows a lot more about this than I do, but they were taken primarily after Andy Warhol had been shot and he almost lost his life. And they were almost an obsessive categorization and documentation of his immediate surroundings at all times. And so they seem like a response to a crisis situation and a way of distancing from that immediate evaluation of safety and security. And we had an amazing research assistant that did some research for this show. Her name's Andrea Truitt. She has a PhD in architectural history, and she now works with Summer of the Arts here. And she wrote a fantastic essay, which I'll be putting on our website later, and I'll share on the Facebook event for this event today. And she talked about these works under the auspices of the term unheimlich, which is a German word that means the uncanny or the unhomely. There's not quite a good translation into English, but this idea that something so familiar can be at the same time not comforting. And she classifies Andy Warhol's images from this period, these photographic images that are mostly interiors of domestic environments, mostly looking out of windows, as feeding into this idea of unheimlich. She also wrote about a series of prints that we included in this exhibition from a printmaker and musician named Terry Allen. Terry Allen released a series of prints called Waras with a rock opera album by the same name. that chronicled the pretty violent journey of two couples who ended up in high drama killing each other. So straight out of Shakespeare, lots of other dramatic tropes being played upon, but the image that's included in these series that I'm passing around is of the aftermath of this violence, and it shows an interior, a domestic interior, with bobby pins, hairpins, as this remnant of violence. And it's kind of a feel-good album, weirdly, if you listen to the music, which I think is strange, and all of these people identified as men, which maybe has something to do with that. But it's intense music for these intense environments that speak to, again, this idea of unheimlich, or the unhomely, when we expect a place to feel familiar and comforting and safe, but it does not. So that's a little bit of a downer. Hopefully we'll get out of the downer. We'll talk more about how to overcome those unsafe feelings, how to create safety for ourselves and our home environments with our amazing panelists. Thank you.
And that,
Thanks.
that tension of the unhomely or the unsettled feeling that you get when the familiar isn't comforting is part of really what's at the heart of our discussion of what's at the heart of homemaking and the ways to, that home is made to be safe or unsafe or stable or unstable, or that kind of feeling of home versus the house of home or the space of home, and when those things are in tension, and how we can as a community work to make those things a little bit more congruent. So we'll start off with our panelists, with Maza here. If you want to introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Mazahir Saleh. I'm originally from Sudan. I came to this country 21 years ago now, and just came for a better life and some opportunities. And I'm a community organizer at the Center for Worker Justice. Graduated from civil engineering from back home. Coming here, I have to start over. And I graduated from Kirkwood Community College. I graduated from EEG, which is electro encephalographic, where EEG, where you're measuring the brain electricity through waves, called EEG. And I'm now Iowa City City Council. I just been elected on 2017 as the first Sudanese American ever in the country. And I have 5 children. All of them go to the schools here in Iowa City, ranging from my youngest, he go to 4th grade, and my oldest, she is a junior at West High. That's all about it.
And sometimes you sleep.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah. By the way, sometimes I sleep like 2 o'clock in the morning.
What have you enjoyed most about Iowa City as a community?
When I moved to Iowa City back on 2011 in November, I came to study and go back to Virginia. Because when I came to this country, I came to Virginia, I stayed there, and after I have my 5 children, everything started to become difficult over there, like living in a 2-bedroom apartment with 5 children, work very hard, my husband and I, to make ends meet. I just figured out, coming with a civil engineering degree and start working like low-wage workers, that's even hurt you a lot, and you cannot even find a good job where you can have a good salary, and also in the same time, you have more time for your children. That's why I decided to study from this country, because my certificate from back home is not like working here. And I came to Iowa City so I can, pursue my education and go back to Virginia. But as a neighbor, and I always remember the first time I came looking for Iowa City to pay my water deposit, and I don't know where is a city of Iowa City, and I was like walking and asked somebody in the street and said, do you know where is Iowa City, city of Iowa City Hall? He said, do you know like Burlington Street? I said, no. He said, Washington Street. I said, no, I'm new in this country. And he just said, follow me, and he showed me the way. I followed that guy until he took me to the city hall. And I just thought like, Iowa, they are nice people. In Virginia, it's really people are like quite of working fast. If you ask them something, they say, no, I don't know that, and they leave. But here people, they give you some time, and I just feel like this home and the small city where everybody know everybody, that make me like really fit. This home for me, that's why I decided not to leave.
And so is that feeling, that initial feeling deepened over time? Has it stayed the same, or has it gotten more that way or less that way? How has it stayed the same or changed?
Really, my friend always called me and say, why did you come back? He said, you are coming back to Virginia after your study. I say, no, I really feel like if we went back to the past, I would come from Sudan direct to Iowa City. These feelings really become stronger, especially like engaging with the community, engaging with the government, engaging with everyone to try to solve. I felt this is really home for me, and even if I see any issues, I start like working hard to like solve those issues in the community. That's really, I guess, it's deepening than is listening. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you have an extensive background just working with as a community organizer with a lot of other immigrants. When you listen to the stories from other immigrants, are their stories more similar to yours in terms of feeling really at home here? Or are they divergent, or is there a range of experiences that you can talk about?
Yeah, this is really it's a hard topic to talk about, because it's not only, I can say, I feel home. Being like staying in Virginia for a long time, if you ask me, I never felt home in Virginia, because maybe I have a lot of barrier that I went through. But for people in Iowa, most of them are newcomers. They came direct from Iowa, from say Sudan or from Africa to Iowa City, where they still struggling. I already overcome those struggles that not make you feel home. That's why maybe for me, I feel like this is more home for me. But for other people, no, I don't think so. And I think like the immigrant face a lot of difficulty. And speaking about those difficulties, just like if we start with speaking the language, the English language, I guess, let's be honest. Our country, the United States, is not a country of bilingual, And so, imagining arriving here, like unable to speak English, and try getting a job and making friends, and even completing, basic tasks like buying food from the store, or just simply filling out a form for application for anything, I guess this is really hard. And in addition to this, many immigrants take ESL classes so they can improve their English. They try really hard to find, but the problem is how they can find the time between job and caring of kids and caring of difficult stuff. Especially difficult if you were not literally in your native tongue, of course, This is, you need time, you are low-wage workers, and you want to go to school at the same time. I want to help your kids in homework. This is obstacle for me. There is many obstacles. One of them is English language, and the other one is raising children and help them succeed in school. One of the biggest obstacles immigrants is raising their children in the unfamiliar cultures. Is parents often find that their children are quickly become Americanized, which maybe is add to their own culture, And additionally, kids tend to become English faster than their parent, and this through of the parent-child dynamic, And kids use this for their own advantage sometimes. I've been seeing that, and also it's good. Parents often feel disappointed to see their children struggle and keep up classes. And many parents report bullying and discrimination and result of cultural difference. This is not going to make you feel home, if you feel all this. And also, kids often placed in the school district by their age rather than by their ability of achievement. So you stay in that, say you came from Sudan, your age is place you in middle school, and you don't know anything. That's why you are not going to do good, because there is no special way of helping those children. And to add further, to the injury, parents might not have the education and the language skill to help their kids. So all this, even though you have the wall and you have the wall and the roof and the bed, but maybe you are not feeling home. That's one of the things. I just don't want to stay like a lot of people say, this money obstacle, I'm going to just say like a secure work. That's also obstacle that doesn't make you feel here at home. You know, and also like, you know, securing housing, that's a big deal. Like affordable housing is crisis in our area, everybody know that. And you know, people pay more than 50%, or I'm paying more than 50%, even though I have decent job and I know the language, and I pay more than 50% just for my home right now of my total income. And we really like live paycheck by paycheck, even though I've been here long enough and I know the language and all the, that's why, you know, sometimes if you have also sophisticated, you cannot feel home.
Yeah. Well, and even, can I follow up just on that tension of language? When your kids are in one culture and you're in another culture,
Exactly.
and there's that sense of unfamiliarity where, I mean, it's hard enough having kids and growing up, you know, watching your kids grow older without you, and then when they're doing that in a different culture than what you know, I mean, that sounds like there's a lot of that kind of unfamiliarity or that tension of the uncanny that
And
you're
it will be tension in the home itself, like you see your kids think what they do is normal. Everybody outside is doing that, and you think this is not normal, and they are doing something bad. And this is, it will be like, sometimes I feel the kids will really start like, you know, lost between two cultures. You know, that's why you have to be careful on doing that.
So, so you mentioned a lot of the kinds of obstacles that immigrants face. I was wondering what 3 changes you thought would be the most necessary to make Iowa City a place where people feel welcome to share their hearts and to make their homes. What 3 changes do you think Iowa City in particular can make?
I guess I have my 3 changes written down.
Okay.
You know, when our voice and our culture is celebrated in a public square, that one is a big change. And I think we are doing that right now. Like by me being on the city council, that's a big one, you know. By the people in this community feeling the teacher at school look like them. We need more diversity everywhere so we can make this happen. Because when I go to school and I see, even our children, when they go to school and they see the teacher look like them, they relate to them, and they will most likely succeed. And also, like when I see a government, like have many people who look like me on the government, I will make sure this government will help me, and like when they do policy, they will count like the ideas or the thing that they affect the people who look like me, because there is somebody who represents them. Will bring, like for me, I think I even though I was city council member, they doing a lot of good things before I come, but I think when I came, I brought new ideas, and I started challenging them for many things, which is making us like, give them a chance to think about like differently than the way that they've been thinking, which is good. I guess just celebrating our culture in the public square, and also every neighborhood is open to people of all social economic level, income. I think people should not be segregated by income, like low income people live somewhere and other people live somewhere. No, we need really, you know, also the people need to get up from the idea about like, make the people welcome in their backyard, not like saying not in my backyard, you know. And also number 3, that our lives here no longer have to be characterized by this series of fighting to be safe and including, like at school, at the neighbor, at work. We don't have to fight for it. It has to be like common sense. You have to be treated everywhere right, you know. But people here are fighting, you know, immigrants are fighting so they can make this community work for everyone. You know, I think we need those changes. Those are my 3 changes.
Thank you so much. Thanks for talking with our panel. All right. And we'll just move through all the panelists, and then we'll have a time for just overall questions at the end. Bronis is here from DVIP, if you'd like to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about how long you've been here in Iowa City and DVIP.
Absolutely. So my name is Bronis Perti, and I am the Director of Client Advocacy Services with the Domestic Violence Intervention Program. That's a mouthful. What I do is I oversee the 8-county operation, and so DBIP has the regional shelter here in Iowa City, but we also serve 7 additional counties: Iowa, Cedar, Washington, Johnson, Henry Lee, Van Buren, and Des Moines counties. We have offices in Mount Pleasant, Burlington, and Keokuk, in addition to Iowa City. And so, in addition to the work that I do with DBIP, I oversee their 8-county crisis line. I'm also a grad student at the University of Iowa. I am one of the founding members of the Johnson County Affordable Housing Coalition. I'm a board member of the Housing Fellowship, and I'm also a part of the local homeless coordinating board. In addition to that, I'm a pastor. I started a church almost 1.5 years ago. So, got a lot on my plate. I came here in February 11th, 1992. My mother was she was a single parent who worked for the Los Angeles Police Department, and for a period of time she was a dispatcher, and then she also trained officers in weapons defense. And around the Rodney King beating period of time, we lived in Linwood, California, which is, I would consider a suburb or a part, it's a part of Los Angeles. Just community relations were deteriorating, and she wanted to be able to offer her 2 children a better opportunity at life, a lot of racial tension. And so my family had to go through the period of the officers being tried. And on February 11th, 1992, my mother put my brother and I on a plane and sent us here to Iowa City to live with a family member who was a former Hawkeye at the University of Iowa and had started a ministry. And so she sent us here. I was 9, so like I had no idea where Iowa was or where we were going, because Los Angeles was everything in and of itself. It was an inner city community that I lived in, but I was accustomed to being around either minorities, people of color, or Mexicans, and I had never been in a predominantly Caucasian area. And so my mother stayed for 4 months, and then she moved to work through the riots, and then she moved to Iowa City to be with us. When I think of the length of time that I've been here, over 25 years, I have been afforded a lot of wonderful opportunities. But when I look back at the journey in which it took me to get to where I am today, I think of a lot of the lower income housing places that existed. They were the stepping stones for my family. One of the first places we lived was Lakeside, which no longer exists. We stayed at Lakeside. We lived on Broadway for an extended period of time. Then we lived on Boston Way. And so those places that are, that are being bought out and renovated for different uses were the places that my family was able to live at, and it was home, and it was a comfortable place. And we lived amongst people that were similar to ourselves. We were hardworking people. My mother was a hard worker. She worked for the Iowa City Police Department for years as a dispatcher. She was a teacher within the Iowa City School District. And being a young girl, watching my mother take care of all of the responsibilities of our household and make sacrifices so that my brother and I were afforded opportunities has made the difference in just kind of the path that my life has taken. And where my mother was working and, to sacrifice and make ends meet, we also had wonderful community programs that were able to supplement. And so living in the Broadway neighborhood, I was able to participate in the Johnson County Broadway neighborhood programming. Back when like Patty Fields and Jeff, and then we're like really young, and they were like our counselors and stuff. And so I have fond memories. It looks a lot different now when I am working with families who have been impacted by domestic violence, and we don't have a lot of the same opportunities that existed when my family came here. It's a lot more challenging to help families navigate, finding housing and finding some type of stability within this community. But that's kind of an overview of my life. I've been educated through the Iowa City public school system, the university, and I'm proud to be a part of this community.
Yeah, so you've really made your home here.
Yes.
And are you planning on staying here?
Yes, I started a church, like I said, 1.5 years ago, and Iowa City is home. We have planted or put our roots down in this community for a while now.
So I want to transition from your story, if that's okay, to your professional life.
Absolutely.
And talk, just kind of bring into the foreground a lot of what makes home uncomfortable for people in a way that not everybody talks about in the foreground. And I was wondering if you could just, because there's very little public information about it that we talk about in the public spaces, can you just give some context about the prevalence of domestic violence in the Johnson County area or within the 8 counties that you serve, or both, and or at least what's reported or what you see, or kind of how that's been changing over the years?
Absolutely. So the Domestic Violence Intervention Program, just a little bit of history about the agency. We started in 1977. It was birthed out of the Women's Resource and Action Center, so RAC, through a grant to explore the prevalence of domestic violence in the community. And so from that point, there was additional funding that would come in, and DVIP was birthed. The Domestic Violence Intervention Program shelter was opened in 1980, offering counseling and a 24-hour crisis line. In 1993 was the completion of our current shelter, which was 13 rooms. And something that has happened that has been significant to victim services in the state of Iowa is in 2013, victim services went through regionalization in the state of Iowa, and so there was a $1.2 million budget cut, and the Iowa Attorney General's office proposed a plan to regionalize services. There were over 20 different programs, and within this new regionalized plan, the state wanted to have 6 regions with a domestic violence shelter in each of those regions, a domestic violence comprehensive services program, and then a sexual assault program. And so DVIP was awarded the bid and became the regionalized sheltering program. We went from serving 4 counties to an additional 4, which made our total 8. And we were the comprehensive program, and then RVAP was also awarded the service for the 8 counties. Within fiscal year 18, we had a total of 1,746 individuals served. Over 298 were served in our local shelter, and 265 youth. One of the things that I think sometimes people don't consider is the impact of domestic violence on kids. We think about the adults or who the primary victim is and not who the secondary victim is. And in our shelter here in Iowa City, majority of the time, at least half of the residents are children. And so we are a unique program in that we have a lot of programming specific to kids to deal with their trauma related to violence. In our outreach services in Johnson County, we've served over 600. We receive every year over, typically over 18,000 calls, and so it's a significant issue. It's a public health, concern in our entire country. Just a few statistics: 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men, according to the National Network to End Domestic Violence, will be impacted by domestic violence at some point within their lifetime. And so, bring me back to your question.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the prevalence of it.
Okay.
Because again, it's something that's underreported. People don't
Absolutely,
self-report.
and so it is a prevalent thing. There are so many misconceptions about domestic violence. I think a lot of times people think that it is something that affects people who are lower income, and while there are people who are victims who happen to be lower income, domestic violence doesn't discriminate. What we know is that the more resources you have and the stronger support system you have, the easier it is for you a lot of times to be able to cover it up, and so we don't necessarily hear about it as often. But what I can tell you is we work with everybody. DVRP has very strict confidentiality laws, and so of course we would not be able to disclose, but it impacts university faculty, students, medical faculty, law enforcement, attorneys, you name it, it's there. And so yes, it is underreported. It impacts individuals from the LGBTQ community, but reporting, support, combating stigmatism within the community is a huge issue, and it also, something we don't talk about as much, is it impacts men. And so we have statistics. When we think of our sheltering program, when we think about the services DVIP provides, men are absolutely included in that, and they access our local shelter and all of the other resources that we provide.
So part of what I've read about the experience of domestic violence deals with that question of what normal means. So there's a sense of like, this is normal, or then there's a sense of this is not normal, but it's okay. And then when people leave, it's this is not normal, and it's not okay, and I need to do something about it, and I have support to help me do that. In the people that you've worked with and in the conversations you've had, can you describe maybe how long it takes to move from one thing to another, or how people shift from one kind of perspective on what their life is to another in terms of what home means?
Well, I think it's very complicated, and for each person, it looks different. We do believe that domestic violence, those unhealthy relationships or those behaviors is something that's learned over time. And you know, we see within our community, these things become normalized from our media and the movies that we watch and the things that we see, you know, even down to like our athletics and stuff, where physical force and violence is praised. You know, there's a reward that's there. And so when you don't learn how to have healthy exchanges or how to build a healthy relationship, it is so easy for it to trickle over into a relationship. You know, when I came into this field, I had no previous experience with domestic violence, and one of the first things I was told, which really, I had an epiphany, and it was, what would it take for you to get away from somebody who knows absolutely everything about you? And so that statement was made, and then was made a second time. What would it take for you to get away from the person that knows absolutely everything about you? And so even though I had not previously been in a domestic violence relationship, I had to look at my own personal experience. And I had to look at the length of time I was in this relationship. Being married, you know, when you're in a relationship with somebody, you don't enter it in thinking that it's gonna go bad. You know, typically the person you're intimate with is the person that you are the most vulnerable to. You know, your finances become merged. You know each other's, you know, job or places of employment. You know each other's colleagues, you know, your friends, you know, everything about you becomes merged in some kind of way. And then when you have children, it complicates this. And so then when you end up leasing or renting an apartment or purchasing a home or purchasing vehicles, you've got assets and businesses. The idea that when there is an altercation or an incident within a relationship that you just drop everything and leave, that's easier said than done. Just like you've merged your whole life over time, it can take as much time, if not longer, to undo those things. What we know from experience and what we know from statistics is it takes a person on average of 7 times of attempting to leave a domestic violence relationship before they have any success. And if that person is a stalker, meaning the partner, they can stalk a partner up to 22 months or longer, which makes it lethal. And so when we look at our community and we look at what it means for home, we are not all afforded the same opportunities. While I think DVIP is a wonderful program and we receive state and federal fundings to be able to help individuals who have left these types of situations get back on their feet. And so assisting with rental, you know, or security deposits, rental assistance, helping with mortgage payments when we're able to, those things are supplemental. And if I'm honest, they're Band-Aids at most, and I oversee those fundings specifically to housing resources. In this community, and we all know the lack of affordable housing, we are fortunate to have the different coalitions and groups banding together to bring more awareness to the community about it. It impacts so many people, from students and professionals, people that work in this community not being able to afford housing. And so you have to count up the cost and what that looks like, that when you make that step to leave this situation, if you truly feel like that's the best step, then what are the supports available to help you until you're able to get back on your feet and sustain some type of decent type of living. And like I said previously in talking about my own situation, a lot of the places that were available, that were affordable, that were instrumental in my family's journey, they don't exist. And so it's easier said than done. The perspective that our agency comes from when helping people navigate their situations is we always take the position that the client is the expert in their situation. They know what's best. And so we are committed to being with that person no matter where they are in their journey. And so some people live in housing with their partner and they're able to leave, and we support them in doing so. And so we will pad resources as we're able to help them, whether that's transitioning to another place in this community, whether that's relocating to another community. Sometimes we encounter situations where there are two people living in a place, and actually the primary victim is the one who is the leaseholder or owns the property. But there are laws that are in place, and so even though that other, the perpetrator would not be on the lease, they still, you can't just force a person to leave. When you've invited somebody into your space and they're there for a significant period of time, which can be 2 weeks, you may want them to leave and call law enforcement. They're not always able to get the person to leave. Some people that will self-resolve and they'll leave on their own out of fear of law enforcement. Others know that, there are measures you have to go through, and I don't know if you know that, like you actually have to take somebody through the process of being evicted. So you can have a friend come and stay with you and decide that they're gonna squat and they don't wanna leave. And so then you have to assume some responsibility in a way that may not have been originally planned to get them to go. And so for each person, you've gotta be able to assess what are options for you. Some people have options, other people, there literally are no options but for them to stay where they're at. And if that is the case, then one of the things that we offer to every single person that we communicate with is safety planning. Safety planning, if I flip that, what are some things that you can do to help you stay safer than what you are? A majority of us have things that we do in our life, whether that's if we're out at nighttime, we phone a friend and we let people know. We have to do those things for people that are in their home. Are there access to weapons? Are there knives that are accessible? When you are being harmed, what does that look like? Is it something consistent? Are there substances that are involved? What is the structure of your house? Are there points of exit and entry that you're able to easily get to get out? You know what I'm saying? If you were to leave your place, where would you go? Is there anybody that knows where you're located? Do you have an emergency bag packed? Do you have access to any financial resources that you could take and put away where your perpetrator doesn't know? What does that look like for you so that if and when you're ready to go and you're able to go, there's some kind of plan in place and that we can help meet you where you're at?
So you talked about this in terms of a public health crisis, and I was wondering if you could comment just on what the long-term effects of staying in a situation that's marked by domestic violence is for adults or for children who are just in that environment. What happens as a result of having that as part of your home?
Absolutely. So a person who's been in a domestic violence relationship, domestic violence is a pattern of behaviors. Ultimately, the goal is to obtain a level of power and control over an individual. It goes beyond physical abuse. It's financial, psychological, emotional, sexual abuse. And the physical injuries can heal. But the long-term emotional, psychological damage is a big part of the long-term stuff. Physical injuries that cause arthritis, hypertension, heart disease, a lot of health-related issues. The costs are significant for treating domestic violence victims and the additional impacts for somebody that has been strangled. There's a higher risk of stroke over time, and so there are a lot of costs for aftercare. For children in homes where one parent is abused, it typically is an environment where there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of anxiety. And a big misconception for kids is that because they may not witness the physical violence, that they're not impacted, but they're impacted by that environment and the tension and the friction and what they feel, and depending on the age, it actually causes changes in their brain and their development. Children ages preschool, young children who witness intimate partner violence may start doing things they used to do when they were younger, such as bedwetting, thumb sucking, increased crying and whining. They may also develop difficulty falling and staying asleep, showing signs of terror, such as stuttering or hiding, and showing signs of severe separation anxiety. School-age children may feel guilty about the abuse and may take it more as a self-reflection or self-blaming for what's going on in their household. Domestic violence and abuse hurts children's self-esteem. Those kids who are in that school age bracket may not choose to participate in school activities, may isolate themselves, may have poor performance in their academics, and have fewer friends or have more problematic behaviors exhibited in school. Teens who witness abuse may act out in negative ways such as fighting, whether that's their peers or family members choosing to skip school. They may also engage in risky behaviors such as having unprotected sex or using alcohol or drugs. Low self-esteem is a factor, and they may start to exhibit some of the same behaviors that they have seen in their homes, such as bullying or fighting, and choosing to enact that out on their peers. More than 15 million children in the United States live in homes in which domestic violence has happened at least once, and these kids are at greater risk for repeating the cycle as adults by entering into abusive relationships or becoming abusers themselves. And we do believe, statistics have shown that it is a learned behavior, and so there's a significant impact.
So given the huge scale of this as a crisis, what are the resources that DVIP has available to help people, at least in this area, that they might not know about? Like what's available for help for making a home safe or leaving an unsafe space?
Okay, so our services, DVIP has the regional shelter. Our capacity is roughly between 40 and 45. If somebody is at a point where they need to get out, the point of entry or access to our services is by calling our crisis line. When you call our crisis line, that person will talk to you about anything that's going on, and that's a family member, that's a friend, that's a person who's actually in that state of crisis, and help them access our other services. And so our shelter, when somebody comes in, they're given a 45-day stay, of which they can qualify for several extensions. We have advocates who are not licensed counselors, but they counsel, and we have housing advocates who help individuals in our shelter or in outreach, which are people who are experiencing domestic violence but need housing resources, help them navigate what's available in the community. And so that could be filling out applications, helping them locate jobs, filling out resumes, anything that they need to be able to get a house and sustain a house. We have staff that have specialized training to be able to do that. We have federal and state funding to be able to assist with security deposits and rental assistance. We participate in a program alongside Shelter House where we provide funding for rapid rehousing for those that are chronically homeless. DVIP receives state funding from CVAD, which is the Crime Victims Assistance Division, to be able to help those who are currently housed but need additional resources to sustain that housing. We do a lot of work within courts. We do a lot of medical advocacy. We do a lot of work within schools. And so however that family is impacted, we're able to assist them as little or as much as they need when they get into housing. So if you get approved for a place, then we work really closely with some of the other area programs to help them find furniture and cover expenses for their rent, help them with transportation, help them get child care, everything that it takes. We piecemeal a lot of stuff together to try to create as much of a sustainable situation as possible.
What are the best parts about working at DVIP? I mean, it sounds like a really hard job that you have to see a lot of really hard things, but what are some of the success stories, or what are the best moments that you've found when working there?
I love DVIP. We are a group of passionate people that truly have a lot of empathy and respect for each other as colleagues. So there's a trust factor there in doing the work that we do. But I consider it a privilege to be able to do this work. I don't consider it a burden. We are able to see people at their most vulnerable, at some of their worst points in life. And so to be able to be a part of their journey and helping them rebuild, helping empower them, helping them regain some control. It's a beautiful thing to see people come into your system that are broken, and a lot of people have lost everything that they have. They literally run for their lives and have come into our system with the clothes on their back with their kids, these heartbreaking situations, but to see them find strength over time and to have a support system in a way that they've never experienced. Actually, I don't know if it would be surprising to you, but when a lot of residents leave, it's actually difficult for them to leave because then they've got to face a lot of these things on their own, whereas coming through the door, you know, if you went on a job interview and it was a great interview, or if it wasn't so good, you have a team of people that are rallying for you, you know, that are helping you reflect and give you perspective on your situation. And so there are so many successful stories, so many fantastic, awesome women and men that have been able to take some of the most horrible things that you and I could never imagine going through and be able to rebuild their lives and be successful, thriving members of our community. And so that is impactful for me. The kids, like, they're all my babies. There's nothing like the children, you know, and just the love, the hugs, and you know, seeing their face and the light, you know, being in a place of being safe and secure and what that means, you know, and so that is what I love about the agency. I consider it a privilege to do this work, and I also think that it is a humbling experience. While I have spoken a little bit about what my journey has been, I recognize my privilege. And a lot of my training has been to recognize my privilege and the opportunities that I've been afforded. And so no matter what is going on in my life, no matter what are the things that I may choose to complain about, when I step on those shelter, you know, when I drive into that parking lot and I'm going into that building, none of those things in my life, honestly, really appear to be significant when I'm looking at all of these different situations and how people find courage and hope and strength to take one more step, to make it one more day in some of the most dire situations. And so there are a lot of things. I feel like my life has been, I've grown, and I feel like I've gained more from the people that I've come across than I have been able to give. And I never expected that to happen coming into this program.
Seems like you've made a home there.
Yeah.
In a really neat way. Can you conclude by just talking about 3 changes that you think would be the most necessary things for making Iowa City a place where more people feel welcome to live as a home?
Yes, I feel like, and I'm going to piggyback a little bit off of Mazahir, embracing diversity. There's something that is so beautiful about diversity and culture. I think a lot of times people are afraid of change, afraid of differences, versus taking the time and being more inclusive and creating spaces where we can learn from one another and see the beauty in each of us and to acknowledge and accept some of the differences too is such a big part. Being a person of color, in majority of the settings that I'm in, I am the only person of color. And I wish that there were more perspectives from people of color amongst, because I can speak from my perspective, but I can't speak for everyone's perspective. There are so many people doing wonderful advocacy work, and I wish that the people who are impacted the most had more of a voice and a seat at these tables, because they are more than capable of articulating their needs, their concerns, their values in a way that is palatable for us. So just that inclusiveness, diversity, embracing it, celebrating it, and being accepting of it is a huge thing. I am a huge advocate for affordable housing, and so I think access to affordable housing is a definite must. We know that over 50% of our housing market is taken up from students, and so I think we're doing great work in this community, great work on behalf of the Board of Supervisors in Johnson County, the City Council, and money's being put aside to go towards affordable housing projects, but creating more, there's just not enough. And so if you've got 30 people vying for this one place, and you've got somebody who may have, a lower credit score, may have something on their criminal background, are they going to get that opportunity if they're going up against a professional in this community, or a student, or somebody that has more of a solid standing? And so access to affordable housing, and then I would say jobs and childcare. More of an affordable wage where people can live. You got a lot of people who are single parent households. You cannot survive making minimum wage. you know, no job security. And so if your child gets sick and you have to take off, you lose your job, or you're working 2 part-time jobs with no benefits. We know. And so I could talk about it until I'm blue in the face. And then childcare, and then transportation, making sure it all works together. Because you can get one in place, but then the other 2 make it so that you can't maintain this one. You know, and I think it would be a place where more people felt like they could put some roots down here and stay, versus being a place that they have to pass through.
Thank you so much for your insight and for sharing about your life and the people that you serve. Thank you. All right, Angelica.
Yeah.
With the Shelter House, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about your life and then Shelter House.
Perfect. My name is Angelica Panetta. I'm the Development Director at Shelter House. I've been there for 18 months. My role as a Development Director is essentially community engagement involvement from a donor's perspective and volunteers, but also educating the community on the work that we do. But my personal home is actually in the Cedar Rapids area, and that's for a couple of different reasons, and it really does tie in with some of the things that we've talked about. So for a long time, I'm a military brat. Also, one of my parents is from Cedar Rapids, and the other parent is from an island in the South Pacific that hardly anybody knows, and it's American Samoa. And oftentimes I'll just tell people, do you know who The Rock is? Dwayne Johnson, there's a 90% chance we're related. So that's kind of how we tie things in together. But so my parents met in the Army in Heidelberg, Germany. And so there were a lot of years that I didn't have a home that was long-term. So every couple of years, we're always moving around. And I think as a young child, that's hard. And when you find a place that you land, that you stay for any amount of time, it's also hard to leave that place as well. So when I was 8, my family landed in Marshalltown, Iowa, which is where Dan and I both grew up. So I was there for a number of years, but my parents divorced, and in that community at the time, it was a largely Caucasian community, and being one of only a handful of people of color in that community was also very difficult growing up. So again, there's all of these things that are underlying that when I finally found a place that's like, all right, I'm gonna be here for a while, it's hard to just pack up and move, right? So I accepted this position with Shelter House about 18 months ago, and some of that was because of my personal belief in housing as a human right. I have done a lot of volunteer work in the Cedar Rapids area. Actually, I've been a commissioner for the Marion Civil Rights Commission and petitioned the City Council in Marion to put together grant funds for affordable housing as well as programs for homelessness, very similar to what the Human Rights Commission in Iowa City has done. So I have been a large part of that as well. And my daughter is a senior in high school this year, so if you can imagine, remember me saying there is no way once I find a place to stay that I'm going to pick up my kids and move them. So that's why I am where I'm at. But I still have a lot of ties to this area. My brother graduated from the University of Iowa and has been in this community since 1996. And so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a good place to be. There are certainly some things that as I've worked in this community, that we need to improve on as it relates to homelessness and affordable housing. And I think that, you know, the three of us have a lot of similarities in what we think needs to happen in the community in order for it to be a place for people to want to stay long term.
Can you give a little bit more history on Shelter House as an organization and what its life here, how it's made a home in Johnson County?
Yes. Yeah, so Shelter House was founded in 1983 by the Consultation of Religious Communities. That was for a number of years in a house on the north side. It was a 2-story house and they had up to 29 beds. It was essentially a place where people could go, sleep for the night, and leave. But around 1994 is when we started to incorporate additional supports and program services. And I think a lot of what we've talked about is a home is not just a roof and a bed, and that's our tagline. But it is all of the other things that make it a comfortable place to be, integrating in the community, all kinds of things, right? And but it is a place for us to start, to have shelter, to have that protection from the elements is a place to start. So in 1994 then, Shelter House added those additional program and support services. And in 2010, we moved into the building that we're in currently on Southgate Avenue. It's a 70-bed shelter that houses men, women, and children. We have dorms for men and women, and then 6 family units. Sometimes and oftentimes we'll double up on families if we need that space, because we kind of have the area divided so that the children have their family space and that they're safe from anybody else who's in the building as well. Because when you get 70 people in one building on one floor, that's a whole lot of chaos. So of course we want to recognize that we need to provide a safe shelter for everybody that's there as well. So in addition to that building, and most people are familiar with Shelter House being an emergency shelter, the other part of our approach, which we've really started to implement in the last 8 years, and which you've probably heard a lot about in the last couple of years, is permanent supportive housing. So we have one additional building that houses 24 one-bedroom units for the chronically homeless, and those are individuals from our community who have not had a home for the last 12 months or have been homeless for 3 times in the last 4 years. So there's HUD's definition, or Housing and Urban Development's definition of chronic homelessness, and so those individuals we're looking to provide a roof and a bed first, and then any additional support systems that they choose to participate in secondary. Because we believe if you have that first, then the whole, it's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? The transportation or the job or the house, what is it? There's all of this stuff, but if we can land them someplace, then they can start to make some incremental progress in some of these other issues that are going on. So we have that building, and then we also have 3 homes in the community that are part of the Fairweather Lodge program. So those are for people who may be at risk of becoming homeless and may be considered episodically homeless. So they maintain their housing periodically, so they can't, for whatever reason, oftentimes a mental health or physical disability, they maintain their housing for short periods of time, and then sometimes potentially chronically homeless individuals. So this Fairweather Lodge program, though, also incorporates a supported employment component and mental health recovery components as well. So really, again, if I'm out at a health fair and people say, oh, I know what Shelter House is, and that's how they respond, I say, oh, well, tell me what you know about Shelter House. And they say, oh, well, it's a shelter, and that's where people go when they're homeless. And then I say, and then that's where I step in, because there really is so much more that we do, and I think that the same thing can be said of DVIP and a lot of the social service agencies that we have in town.
Can you just give a little context for how many people in the corridor are affected by homelessness?
Yeah, so I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier. There are actually 3 different segments of homelessness, and I think that a lot of people in the community consider everyone who's experiencing homelessness as the individual who's panhandling on the corner in front of Walmart, or someone who is drunk sleeping in a park. So that stereotype exists for a reason, and those are some of the individuals that we support. But there are people who are transitionally homeless, so those are people who are going to stay at shelter for a short period of time due to a catastrophic event, or a crisis. So maybe a domestic violence situation, unplanned pregnancy, a sudden eviction, a sudden job loss, an accident. There's any number of reasons why someone might find themselves unable to maintain their housing. So last year we provided support for 887 individuals who we consider transitionally homeless. And then there are the people who are episodically homeless, so they have the frequent cycle in and out of the system, or in and out of housing. And through our Fairweather Lodge program over the course of a year, we've probably helped anywhere from 20 to 30 individuals. And then we have the chronically homeless. So when we were putting together the Cross Park Place or Housing First project in the Iowa City area, and we had a referral list of all of the agencies that we partner with in the community, that list grew to 60 plus. Remember, we only had 24 units. So we were able to house 24 individuals, and we're continuing to work with others. But if you kind of look at this whole pie chart, I'd say 85% of the people in the community are transitionally homeless, 5%, 5 to 10, somewhere in there would be episodically homeless, and then a smaller percentage are chronically homeless. But I'd say close to 1,000 individuals, and that's just in the Johnson County area. So the numbers that Brontes was sharing earlier was a combined number of 8 counties. So the support that we serve is really concentrated. We do support Washington County, but that's a very small subset of the overall number of people that we're serving. So, you know, it is interesting. When I started this position, my dad, again, who's from Cedar Rapids, said, I didn't think that there was a homelessness issue in Iowa City. You just don't see it. I think that we can live our lives in this community and not see it. So oftentimes, I think you have to peel back the layers to find out what some of those issues are. Again, same situation here as with DPIP.
So you've talked a lot about how part of what makes a home possible is community, and that includes things like job security, transportation, childcare, you know, the cost of food, the cost of, like, all of those things come together. And with the people that you've worked with and the stories that you've heard, what are the things that start to tilt people away from a place of security to sudden, like, all of a sudden you realize that you can't pay rent or something along those lines? Can you describe that situation?
Yeah, I mean, essentially it is lack of living wages, right? So it's poverty. So, you know, homelessness affects people of all backgrounds, racial backgrounds, etc. But the one thing that everybody has in common is that they are below the poverty line. They are able to maintain housing because they can't afford to. And so then other things that are all a part of that cycle with the inability to fund stuff, right, would be access to health care. A lot of the people that we are working with do have a diagnosed mental illness. I do also want to step back a little bit because I don't want there to be a stigmatism that everybody who has a mental illness is homeless and everybody who is experiencing homelessness has a mental illness, because that's not the case. But there's also a disproportionate number of people who are experiencing homelessness who have a diagnosed mental illness. So access to mental health care, access to general health care. So another reason why people are unable to afford to pay their rent is because they can't keep a job because they're physically unable to. So they also have a disability. So there's all of those sort of things that are part of this huge cycle. So really though, what we talk about at Shelter House with the things that need to be fixed really in society in general, not just in Iowa City or Johnson County, would be access to mental health care and general health care, affordable housing, and then livable wages. So.
In terms of visibility, you said that, like, it seems like homelessness is invisible. Can you describe what some of the like where people aren't looking or where evidence of homelessness is that people just are not looking toward, or things like that?
Well, I think that there are some people in any community who just are comfortable with the wool being pulled over their eyes. Does that make sense? Like, they aren't intentional on trying to find out if there is a situation in the community. Oftentimes though, like the number of chronically homeless, you might see 1 or 2 people in a park, you might see someone panhandling, but they're in the encampments under bridges. So you just peel back the layers and go under the Gilbert Street Bridge, right? There's an encampment that exists there, and that's where people are. So yeah, and then I think the other part of it too is people don't often consider individuals who are couch surfing or doubling up with roommates as being someone who is homeless, but that's not the case. They don't have their own space, and maybe it's because of a lack of affordable housing. There's any number of reasons, but they are doubling up on top of each other and they don't have their own consistent space. So those are just some of the other invisible ways in which homelessness exists.
In terms of that kind of weird, uncanny question of home, like how much is the encampment a home for people? How much is couch surfing a home for people? How much is Shelter House a home? Like, just with the communities and the people that you've heard.
Well, you know, and I think that we try to make sure that people feel welcome and that we do create some sense of home for individuals. But, you know, one of the questions that was shared with us ahead of time, they're like what was a striking moment for you, right? And this certainly ties in with the art aspect. We participate in National Hunger and Homelessness Awareness Week and have for a number of years. A couple of years ago, a few photographers came to us and said they'd like to do a series based on home. So they were photographs. And one of the photographs then, for them to start, was an encampment. And so it's a mattress. It's a very striking photograph was actually a business shirt hung up next to a bicycle. So it was just it was probably someone who had a normal 9-to-5 job, but it was a business shirt hung up on a hanger next to a mattress next to a bicycle. And so the individuals who live in the encampments do create their own sense of home, and there was some hesitancy for some of those individuals that we've helped through our Cross Park Place, our Housing First project, to move out of the encampment into this because it's something that they've known for so long, right? That's what's comfortable for them. But we have worked with them and they have definitely seen some progress, even if it's only incremental progress. But so they do create a home, and then another part of this series was a photograph of a home, of one of our family rooms at the shelter house. And to see the kids pointing out, you know, this is where they keep their toys, or, you know, this is their favorite stuffed animal that they keep there. And then the final photograph in this series, of course, was an actual home that we would move the family out into, and then to see it all done up, especially that kid's space. And so it was photographs of bedroom spaces, right? So I think that we try to make a home where we're at, but that doesn't mean where we're at is where we should be.
Yeah, makes sense. Shelter House works a lot with veterans too, the veteran population, and as a former military child,
Yes.
I'm sure that's I mean, Eric could see where that would be an important factor. Can you just talk about the relationship of veterans in the Iowa City or the Johnson County community, and how that relates or doesn't relate to housing insecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. So last year then, so each year there's a point in time count that the homeless service agencies do across the country. And so there were about 40,000 homeless veterans across the United States identified. So that's only about 10% of the overall homeless adults. And that's largely because during the Obama administration, one of the things that Secretary Castro and the Obama administration really tried to focus on was to decrease homeless veterans, and so they decreased it by 48%. So that was really incredible, and that really took a concerted effort. So there are some unique reasons that someone who is a veteran might be experiencing homelessness. So they experience it for all the same reasons, so they don't have necessarily access to health care. We're lucky because we have the VA hospital here, but you might have someone who isn't close to a VA hospital. They may find it difficult to maintain employment because of constant deployments. But one thing that is specific to that particular population is because sometimes they're coming back with PTSD or traumatic brain injuries. And again, mental health is a really a part of the services that we provide and a part of why someone can become homeless. So there are those situations. And then here, we do find, though, that there are some individuals who will go to the VA hospital in Iowa City and then be discharged, but not have a place to go back home to. So they left where they were, they received care here, so we will help those individuals as well. We do receive funding from the VA, and we actually have 11 beds at Shelter House that are dedicated to veterans that are funded through the VA program, and they can actually stay with us for up to 2 years. That's pretty rare. Most times we're gonna work to get individuals acclimated or integrated into the community.
Can you talk a little bit about addiction? You mentioned the stereotype of the drunk in the park or something like that,
Sure.
but just the relationship of addiction and homelessness within
Sure.
our community?
So, as far as addiction, I mean, that's another interesting thing in that sometimes addiction can be a result of someone's homelessness because it's a hard life to live on the streets or it's a hard life to couch surf. But addiction can also sometimes cause someone's homelessness because it reduces the family support. It sort of like breaks down that family support. And so really a lot of the people that we're working with don't have that support system, or they don't have the same amount of resiliency that may have been afforded to someone who has a different lifestyle, right? So addiction it's one of those things that, again, what causes the other. But there are a large number of people that we work with who have addictions or substance abuse.
So as a housing agency, you end up, it sounds like Shelter House plays a lot of different kinds of roles in terms of not just housing, but a lot of counseling, a lot of therapy, a lot of job employment or job training. I mean, how many things don't you do?
I mean, though, I would say that it really focuses on those things. Again, I continue to say housing, livable wages, access to health care, right? So those are the areas that we do really focus on. But yeah, you know, and I guess one thing that as you were talking, and it does tie into that addiction question, is that because we believe that housing is a fundamental human right, we have started to go away from individuals that we help to go through sort of this series of things that they need to meet, right? Like you need to do this before X happens or X, Y, Z, right? So that's the whole housing first principle, is that regardless of what's going on in someone's life, if they have an addiction, if they are an alcoholic, we're not going to say, I'm sorry, you don't deserve a place to stay. Because then when we provide them with that housing, they are in a much more safe space so that they can address some of the other crisis situations, mental health or addiction or what have you. And that just makes for a stronger community for everybody, right? When we provide that resource for some of the most vulnerable in our community.
What brings you joy in terms of working there? Like what's really some of the higher points, or a story or a success moment, or?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think it's really in the day-to-day, right? So when we see kids who are showing us their bedroom when they move out, when someone comes in at the front desk and they're like, guess what, I just got a job, I'm gonna start tomorrow, right? So those are all of the great things. But, you know, one of the main reasons that I chose to work at Shelter House is because I had some of that instability in my life. I didn't experience homelessness, but being a military child is a very unstable, especially when you are so young. So to be able to provide that stability for the people that we work with really brings me joy and happiness.
I'm sorry, just to back up, one other thing, is something that you've alluded to throughout that I want to just kind of bring to the foreground. You've talked a lot about the working homeless. I mean, between the the business shirt and the bicycle and the mattress to people who have a job but not enough of a job, or not enough jobs, period, or not enough hours in a week at jobs. Can you just talk about the situation of the working homeless?
Yeah, I mean, that's just what you just said though, right? Like they may not have enough hours, they may not have a livable wage. It may be where they can't maintain their employment for long enough periods of time to save up money. There's any number of reasons that might constitute that, but we do provide those employment services that we've talked about, and 65% of the individuals that we work with exit the shelter with a significant source of income. So that's something that we work with them on as well. And some of them may just not have ever had the opportunity or the need to create a budget. So things maybe along those lines to say, this is how much we can put away so that we can have sort of a slush fund so that, if this job goes away tomorrow, you still can pay some of your rent. We offer, rental assistance, deposit assistance, all kinds of housing program funding comes through Shelter House as well. But it's also about helping individuals move beyond that homelessness, and there's so many things that roll up into that.
All right. Anything else from Shelter House?
No, I don't think so. Just thanks for having us here.
Thank you for being here. Thanks for the work that you do for our community.
Sure.
All right, Jim, welcome. If you want to introduce yourself and your relationships with the community.
Sure, Dan, it's a real pleasure to be here. But the first thing I want to say is I feel like I ought to just sit here and shut up and listen, because we have three really amazing women doing great work here in Iowa City. We're very lucky that that's the case. So, but I guess I should, answer your question too. Boy, I've lived here for 33 years, moved here in 1986 with my then wife and our two sons. Before that, I had lived in Louisville, Kentucky, South Bend, Indiana, Kansas City, Missouri, Los Angeles, Chicago, then here, and I have visited lots of other places in at least 2 other continents, and have lived in southern France and in central Germany. So I've kind of been around, though there are lots of other parts of the world I've not been to. I came here to teach at the university. I had lots of experience doing other things outside of the academic world, but I always had kind of a mix of academic and practical work going on for a long time. So I started teaching urban and regional planning here at the university in 1986, and did that for 24 years until I retired in 2010. And a year later, I decided to unretire, sort of, and seek election to the city council. I was elected. I'm now in my 8th year. I was elected by the council as mayor over 3 years ago. I'm in my 4th year as mayor of the city. Yeah, and I was on the city council for a couple years back in the mid-1990s as well. And so some people may be aware of that, others not. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me, just to start off with.
Yeah, and in terms of, so Iowa City is unique in terms of being a city with a major university that sometimes they flow together really congruently, and sometimes there's a lot of disjunction. As somebody who's spent time both in administration at the city level and as part of the university, can you talk about what the university's relationship to home is in this specific area?
To home. Well, first thing I think, at least what my notes tell me, is that in the time I've been here, the university has changed, the city has changed, and I personally have changed. So it's a pretty fluid kind of situation, so it's kind of hard to pin down why any one thing might have happened, because all three were changing simultaneously, basically. The university has become much more privatized and much more focused on sort of business-like operations. In that sense, it's very different from when I first started. The city of Iowa City has grown substantially. I think there were almost 60,000 people living here when I started on the city council in the mid-90s, and now there are 75,000 or thereabouts. The population is much more diverse than it used to be, especially with regard to recent refugees, Congolese, Sudanese, etc. Part of the population of the university is much more diverse. There's a large Chinese population, though that population's gone down a little bit. There's a substantial Korean population, a substantial Indian population, or South Asian population. So that's at play as well. But it's hard to answer your question more fully without getting into my own ideas about home.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think might be helpful. And
please.
You know, I'm trained as an urban planner, and I also practice as a mayor. And when I think about home, I connect it to ideas about place connectedness, and storytelling, because most of my research is focused on the link between urban planning and storytelling. So I want to go that way a little bit. And I want to read a little bit of text here to kind of get myself loosened up. So I think the idea of home's connected those other topics, place connection, and storytelling. Consider any person who just moved here just moved into Iowa City, which I did 33 years ago, and each of you have done in your own ways. So, like I said, I moved here with my former wife, my 2 sons, and we began living in a house in an older East Side neighborhood. The house had no meaning to me until my family and I began inhabiting it, filling it with personal items, planting flowers in the garden, developing an emotional attachment to it, and transforming it into our home. So that kind of lives out the notion that a house is not a home. You transform it into a home. So too, we began to inhabit our neighborhood, finding our favorite places to walk, discovering our favorite places to go. One of them was the mill way back when. Seeing familiar faces. Of course, they weren't familiar until we gradually started recognizing them. And there's all sorts of interesting language about, I don't know, unfamiliar neighbors and so on, but I won't go into all that. And not so much at first thinking about ways to improve the neighborhood. I think you have to be in the place long enough to feel stable enough, at least as it matters to you, before you can really try to be improving the neighborhood, because otherwise you don't know what you're doing. Yeah, likewise, over time. Although with decreasing intimacy, we gradually began to inhabit the city as a whole and the region in which we found ourselves living. So, when you first move here, you know who you know the place you're at, maybe you know the place you work and how to get back and forth, but you don't know the city as a whole. And this connects to the university part. Over the years, I've learned that most faculty don't have much idea at all about the city as a whole. They focus on their research, on their publications. That's what they're told to do, and that's what they do. And I've had amazing conversations with faculty who don't know where a place like the intersection of College and Gilbert Streets is. Wow, you don't know where that is, and we're just building this 15-story building there, you don't know where it is. Yeah, so that's part of what's going on. You have to be here long enough to know where stuff is.
How long is long enough?
Oh, I have no idea. It depends on the person, but I'll get back into that a little bit, because I think the whole idea of home is extremely complicated in a very, very interesting way, some of which leads into Unheimlich, which you just mentioned. Yeah, so in this sense, a place is where one can feel at home, with the idea of home expanding from the scale of the house to the scales of the neighborhood, the city, the region, and ultimately the earth. And if we don't believe that our home is the earth, we are in very big trouble. So the question then becomes, how can one live in one's home when the home is at the scale of the earth? Okay, so at every scale, being home means being where one can be oneself and live authentically. But what it means to be oneself and live authentically can change quite a bit along the way. I assure you it has for me, because in large part, it's a function of who you meet, what you hear from them in the way of stories they narrate about where they've been, what they've done, what they're doing now, and so on. You got to hear those kind of stories from them. And you've got to learn from events that occur here or have occurred here and become part of the story of the city. But you've got to learn about those events, because for some people they're tremendously important, and for other people they're completely invisible. We have no idea that they happened. How many people know that there were anti-war protests and near riots down at the intersection of Jefferson Street and, what is that, Madison, or is it Capitol? It's Madison, is it? Yeah, well, who knew that? Well, a lot of people, but many of them are not around anymore. They moved away, or they died, or forgot, or whatever. So, yeah, so you got to learn from those events. Any of those kinds of things, stories, events, people, etc., that have a bearing on your own sense of home and your own sense of place connectedness. In a sense, your home is strongly influenced by this, what I think of as a complex web of locally grounded common urban narratives. And by the ways in which that web of stories shapes the physical and social unfolding of the place in which you live. They're intertwined. They affect one another. I actually have a label for this complex web, and that is a psychogeographic economy of spirit. So, which is largely invisible, but it's profoundly important. Okay, so I'm going to just name a few stories and attach names of individuals to some of them, and I'll use some hypothetical names in some cases. So there's something I think of as the founder's tale. So all you have to do is look at the statue of Irving Weber over here on Iowa Avenue and read some of his books, and you'll get a sense of the founder's tale. Meaning, westward the course of empire, European settlers moving west, founding the city of Iowa City in 1839, putting up a few buildings, some of which still stand, and the university being located here, old Capitol being built, this kind of tale. Who does that leave out is the question that immediately arises. It leaves out the people who lived here for 10,000 or more years in one way or another, the native tribes that were here before.
And are still here.
And are still here, yes, exactly. So it's important to kind of think about, okay, whose story is being told here when you tell the founder's tale? All right, then there's what I think of as the city of ghosts, which is, I think of my historic preservation advocate friends. I am a very strong supporter of historic preservation, but what they are very adept at is identifying specific buildings, gaining information, reporting information about when those buildings were constructed, who built them, what they were connected to, what's meritorious about their architecture and all this kind of stuff. And if you read the narratives they write carefully enough, you'll begin to understand that there are stories embedded in those narratives that become very interesting in their own rights. But they want to preserve the structures, etc. But there are all sorts of stories that are associated with the people who used to live here and maybe were attached to those buildings, maybe not. But their stories either are retained in the imagination of some people or else have gone completely invisible and are no longer being told. I think as one example of a recent publication that was in the Iowa Annals of History, I think is the title of the journal. It focuses on Mexican Americans who live south of the railroad tracks west of Gilbert Street. So who knew that there was a Mexican barrio basically there back in the 30s and maybe a little bit before that? Well, people knew. I didn't know, but you read, oh, well, you discover some facts about that. There's also the city of fear. This is often told by white people who are scared about colored people, people of color moving into their neighborhoods because they feel tremendously fearful that those others will bring crime and danger, etc., into the treasured neighborhood, if you will. This is more of a story told in large cities than it is a story told about smaller cities, such as Iowa City, but we have our own version of it, and it's rooted in, or it's located in the southeastern part of our city. So there's that tale. And then there's sort of the inverse of that, which is a story about the city of oppression and hope, which is in part an African-American tale, a tale of black people being oppressed over the years through Jim Crow laws and then through segregation and all that kind of stuff. Eventually resisting that, so it becomes a city of hope. It's about transforming the city so that there are opportunities for black people. But if you look carefully at the Mexican-American narrative in Texas, California, and Arizona and New Mexico, you'll see something similar. If you look at California, you'll see something similar with regard to Chinese immigrants and the experiences of oppression that they experienced, and so on. But there's that tale. Then there's also what I think of as the immigrant's journey, which is a really broad shorthand label for what Mazahir describes so brilliantly, but also for so many diverse populations that have moved to Iowa City and elsewhere and other cities. So, but the immigrant's journey, think about Jewish people moving here in the late 1800s after suffering pogroms in Russia, or about Germans moving here in the 1840s, escaping certain kinds of situations in central Germany or Austro-Hungary, and so on. This is a deep, very interesting, complicated tale that has multiple versions because it really depends on who you're talking about and when you're talking about. I also think about, I got two more I want to touch on. Two more have to do with one has to do with what I think of, this is a bad label, I'm going to change it because it's so dated, sex and the creative city. So this is like stories about the importance of growing the economy. And the way to do it is to build structures like we're in right now, and renovate buildings like the Englert, so we're really expanding on the artistic economy, attracting younger, smart people to the city so that the economy can grow and thrive into the future. So this is a very, very prominent tale, and my label doesn't really do it justice. The last is, again, a bad label, what I think of as a city of boiling frogs, which means if you put a frog in a pot of water and gradually turn the heat up until the frog won't try to escape until it's too late, because by that time the frog will boil. So that's like the environmentalist tale about the kind of world we're creating without really being aware of it because we're not collectively paying sufficient attention to it. So think about the Alberta tar sands where oil comes from now. It's absolutely destroying that part of Canada. Or think about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico that occurred several years ago. Horrific event, a brilliant film about it, absolutely horrific event. So this is normal stuff. Or think about climate change. What kind of world are we constructing where we are completely unaware of what economists call negative externalities that are resulting in the heating of our climate and therefore resulting in extreme weather events that we're seeing all the time now. Sometimes they hit here, sometimes they hit out on the western part of Iowa, sometimes they hit somewhere else, you don't know where it's going to hit, but extreme weather events. And if we don't do something about that, we're in a really serious problem. So all these things weave together and construct a very complicated web of stories about home and who we are, where we are, what kind of home we're building, how resilient and how, if you will, sustainable that home can be. Sorry, I took long time.
No, that was fascinating. Thank you. As mayor, then, when you have this kind of all these layers of stories that sediment down as a foundation for different ways that people can access home, as a mayor, especially educated and versed in urban and regional planning, what kind of story about Iowa City as a home are you trying to build the community toward?
Yeah, well, as Maz knows, because she and I have jointly agreed to this, along with other council members, we're trying to construct a more inclusive, just, and sustainable city. And when I first ran for re-election 4 years ago, I said, I want to build on what's already great about Iowa City and lead it toward becoming a more just city. So then that got transformed into inclusive, just, and sustainable. So that is what I'm trying to do. So if you think about you have to think then about what those words mean. So I grew up in a black-white world, Louisville, or Louisville, Kentucky, and that city was really divided into three parts. There was the black West End, mostly lower income. There was the wealthy upper East End of white people, and then the working class white population, which was down south. Here, it's been basically a white population. Now it's much, much more complicated. So you've got to figure out ways in which these diverse parts of our population can be included, just as Bonus and Maz stated very clearly, in our organizations, in our boards, on our boards and commissions, in public spaces of the city, and in those places. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because you got to remember, and this is one of the questions you asked me, you got to remember, if you think, imagine that this rectangle constitutes the city limits of Iowa City. If you think the elected representatives of Iowa City can control what happens in this city, you are wrong. We cannot. Why is that? Because we live in a capitalist economy. That's the first thing, or a market economy. So there are market investors who do all sorts of things here that we have no control over really at all. Like, the trailer court situation. This private investor lives, a company the investors live somewhere else. They decide they're going to buy up trailer courts and they're going to jack the rents way up. Well, we can't control their ability to buy the trailer courts. And then there are significant limits on how we can constrain what they do with those trailer courts. So we live in a capitalist economy. We're strongly affected by state law. If you read the U.S. Constitution, you will see that cities do not appear in the U.S. Constitution. Cities are creatures of the state. The powers we have are given to us by the state legislature. And they can take powers away. And I'll tell you, they've been taking powers away big time over the past 2 and now the 2 years plus this current legislative session. And then there's federal law, federal executive orders, and federal budgets and so on. So we're constrained by that too. If the president says he's going to send ICE into Iowa City, or instruct the Department of Homeland Security to send ICE into Iowa City to try to round up undocumented residents. We cannot control that. We can control what our police department does, but we cannot control what ICE does. And so on. So there are tremendous constraints on what we in Iowa City can do, especially as the elected officials of Iowa City.
So if those are some of the obstacles from, again, like an urban planning environment that are a lot of the top-down external forces, you know, whether it's capitalism, whether it's state law, or whatever it is that are coming down from the top, how do you think that Iowa City, in terms of a home environment, is able to combat that through neighborhoods, or as you were describing, like getting to know people, or walk around your block, or plant flowers, or any of those things? Like, is that enough of an alternative to outside forces coming down and buying up properties and jacking up the rent?
Well, is it enough? I don't know about that, but there is a lot we can do in terms of, I'm going to give you some text here from, comes out of the last two State of the City speeches I've made. So I said something pretty much like this: we need to strengthen bonds of community across racial, ethnic, religious, and political divides, and to stand strong together in solidarity with everyone who is at risk. And we need, I ended two speeches with this, we need to lead with love. And by leading with love, help to build the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community right here in Iowa City. We can do that kind of thing. Part of what's hard, though, constraints, you know, is we cannot, at least I see no way in which we can build neighborhoods or convert existing neighborhoods into ones that are economically diverse. I do not see how we can do that, because people build homes, like $550,000 homes in certain neighborhoods, and there are a whole bunch of homes around it like that, and it's zoned a certain way. We can't just change the zoning out from under their feet. So I don't see any viable way of saying, hey, we're going to take steps to enable lower income people to live in that neighborhood. We can do a lot with regard to new neighborhoods that are being built, and in fact we're doing that with regard to the area around Alexander Elementary and a few other things that I don't want to go into, it's too complicated. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
A little bit, yeah.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
You did not get this one ahead of time, but I think it's in line with Dan's questions for sure. So as an artist and an art historian and someone that thinks a lot about visual ways of being in the world, what does this look like? Do you know of a city that does what you're talking about effectively, that is comparable in scale to Iowa City?
That looks like it.
That looks like a more just, sustainable, and inclusive city. Where's doing this successfully?
Well, my wife, daughter, and I were in Helsinki, Finland last summer, and I see evidence of that kind of city in Helsinki. It's much larger than our city is, and I'm sure it has its own challenges that they know and I don't know anywhere near as well as they do. But I'd point to it.
Okay.
Yeah. In the U.S., no, I don't really. I think in some ways we are way ahead of most other cities in the United States. We're lucky in a sense because we do have this university here, and as endangered as it is, there are a lot of great faculty and great staff and great students there. Some of them commit a lot of energy to trying to improve the place in which they live as well as the place in which they work. So we're lucky in that sense. But
you're inventing it as you go along.
yeah, I actually have a phrase for it, and that is, I believe that city officials and lots of other people are involved in a process of co-crafting the unfolding of their cities. So that's very different from planning the future. I don't think it's possible to formally plan the future. I don't think it's possible to predict the future of cities. But I think we can step by step, co-craft the unfolding of our city. So what that's meant for me the whole time I've been on the city council is to look for every moment when I can exert the discretion I have to turn whatever the decision is toward a more just direction. For me, the lodestar is, the North Star is inclusive, just, and sustainable. So every decision I make is guided by that. And sometimes it still ends up being a bad decision, and maybe I'm a contributor to the bad decision. But that's what I try to do all the time.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So again, art historian, a lot of the ways that I orient to storytelling, which is what all of you have done here so beautifully today. Thank you for sharing your experiences, the experiences of those that you work with immediately. I think of art as a way of telling these stories collectively.
I do too.
So public art is a thing that we're working on right now.
Yeah,
I'm the
I know.
chairperson of the Public
Yeah.
Art Advisory Committee for the city. And we have, as a city, decided to increase our budget for public art
Mhm.
by 100%. So from $25,000-ish a year to $50,000 a year. How do you see art as playing into creation or co-creation of a public narrative? Can art be a solution in the public sphere if we're doing things like showing and celebrating all of the cultures that we have in Iowa City, or all of the different stories that come together to create?
Oh, I think absolutely.
Yeah.
The answer is absolutely yes. Think about theater, theatrical arts.
yeah.
Think about music. Think about singing. Thinking about painting, other visual arts, film. Yeah, all of that is just there, present, ready to be mobilized. And I've had lots of conversations with people in the arts community. You know, Andre Perry and the Englert and Joe Tiefenthaler and the film scene and lots of other people about this. So I think there's enormous opportunity. I want to give you well, here's a gift with regard to your own art.
Mm-hmm.
When you displayed some of the work out here last summer, was it, with regard to home?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought that was brilliant. But also, when I was looking at it, I was thinking, okay, let's think very clearly about where the furniture, appliances, and other objects in our homes comes from.
Yes.
And how were they manufactured? Where were they manufactured? Who manufactured them? What were those working lives? What were the lives of those workers? What were the environmental consequences of producing those products there? So, this was made in Shenzhen, China. And I've seen some images of the enormous facility in which these things are made, and the workers who are doing like one thing, or I don't know, whatever they're doing, they're working on this little thing, and in a very regimented kind of way. And anyhow, I think bringing all that stuff I just said to the consciousness of people through your and other person's art would be a huge step forward.
Good to know.
For the rest of you, I mean, how do you think art would play a role in contributing to alleviating some of the struggles that you see at Shelter House or through DVIP or through some of the communities that you work with as part of your work on City Council? How big of a factor is art in creating a sense of home for people who are arriving here the first time or who are transitioning from different places of home instability?
That's a hard question.
Yeah.
And I had an idea that went, and then, so one thing that we've tried to incorporate in some of our supportive programming for individuals with diagnosed mental illness is art therapy. So just incorporating that and recognizing the benefits that it has for the people who are struggling in such a state of crisis has been really important for us. And then this year so we've partnered with Film Scene for 2 years in a row, and then this year we actually had 2 individuals who have diagnosed mental illness create their own art for us. And then I actually have one of the pieces in my office, and I'm kind of going back to something you had said earlier, what's a great moment that you've had, but I had done a television interview, and I've don't really pay attention to what's in my office, and it was in the background, and he said that one of his friends had seen his artwork that was also the same piece that was that film scene in this video, this interview that I had done. So it really comes full circle, I think, for us, and maybe ways that people don't necessarily think, because I don't think that for us necessarily, if you say how does art and social service or art and homelessness tie together, sometimes it's hard to identify how that happens, but I think that if you really dig deeper, you can see that there are some ways that it's been beneficial for us, for sure.
And for, I guess, regarding immigrants and art, you know, the immigrant, when they arrive here, if they don't like start like seeing that the people in this community, they don't eat their food and they don't hear their music, they don't know the way that they dress, why they dress the way that they dress, and if they don't celebrate their culture, they are not gonna feel home. But if we can give chance, I know that now the Sudanese community are looking forward for support from the community or finding grants so they can have like a festival every year, like a Sudanese festival where they can bring their food, sell their food, people can come and test their food, and you know, look why they want to do like fashion show for the Sudanese clothes, why people wear what they wear during like a special event, like marriage clothes or like tradition Sudanese, the way that people wear clothes, because sometimes they wear this around the town and people like look at them, who's those? You know, when they come and celebrate this through art, and you know, introducing their culture to the community, this is what make the people engage, and so those immigrants will feel home again, because you know, they seeing everything that they miss back home. Now people are celebrating it with them. I guess it will be awesome if that can happen.
If I can elaborate very briefly, last summer we held a sponsored a Latino festival on Main Street, and I think for the first time, the Latino residents of our city felt like there was a place they could be
Exactly.
and be themselves and enjoy that.
Yeah, I think
At least
we
in
need
public
to do
space.
more than that, more of this kind of thing. As soon as you eat somebody's food and you're gonna say, oh, that's good, you know, that's instantly you make a friend, you know, and which is great, you know. This is.
I would briefly say, similar to Shelter House, we do a lot of art therapy, art programs for our women, men, and children. And we'll have groups that come in and do different projects and take like still pictures and things to capture positive moments of the family, because so many people have left the things that, you know, have been so valuable, so that they can take those things when they're going into their home to have something as a positive reflection of, you know, a moment in time, but what they're trying to rebuild.
Are there any other questions?
Just my own statement on the questions. I grew up in a college town very much like this in Syracuse, New York. The Rust Belt, most of the companies had fled down south, so it was really just the university for the town. And my parents' neighborhood was one of the last residential where people owned the homes. So it was mostly faculty or people that worked at the hospital. It was very white. We had a few black families, mostly like doctors or people tried to move in, ended up feeling not particularly comfortable. In a very liberal white community, moved out on the edge of a student ghetto, which had been family homes, but the white flight to the suburbs had become a student ghetto. And so there was always tensions, you know, the kids were making a mess, slaughtering. The kids, as they would do, ran the houses down to the ground. There was a lot of people, landlords who lived out of town, didn't particularly care. I mean, putting as little into the homes as they could to keep the students. The students really ran the houses down, because what do they care? They're 19 and, you know, they're moving on. And then we started to get all these big box international and national developers putting up condo buildings, and suddenly they devalued the student properties and the houses have been run down, and we started getting Section 8 housing. So for the first time we had a number of black and Latin families moving in, but now you have very poor people living next to very rich students, and there was a lot of crime, and there's still a lot of racial tension. And so it's a kind of despair, frankly, in the last couple of years to see these big box apartments coming up, because I feel like we're speeding into this cycle where suddenly some of these properties around here are probably going to become available to poor people to move in. But I don't see how we don't get into this thing of these tensions of the people coming in and have very little, they're going to be right next to these students who are literally driving Maseratis and Ferraris. And I I'm worried we're headed the way that my family's old community is headed. And I know the city has very little power to stop it, but like I said, it's just kind of a visceral sense of, I'm afraid we're going to get some integration and we're going to get some new possibilities, but they're not going to happen in a nice, planned, civil way where people have the connections and get to know each other. That's maybe this kind of culture clash. It's just sort of,
If I could,
Yeah,
you've described the phenomenon that's very similar to what we've experienced in Iowa City, but
Yeah.
not identical. And we do have some authority over where these kinds of, if you will, big box.
yeah, I don't mean it, but we just walk by.
So, we have rezoned or created an area we call riverfront crossings.
Yeah.
It's all this area south of Burlington Street and west of Gilbert Street. Most of the newer apartment buildings are there. Not all of them. There are a couple immediately around downtown. But you don't see them in the older neighborhoods.
No, I understand, but the students, if they have a choice between a brand new condo with the shiny fridge or the rundown home, I'm afraid they're going to do what they did in Syracuse and go to the condo and take, so the value gets kind of pulled out of the existing homes. And then we're looking for a home now. Unfortunately, I see a lot of listings that say no Section 8, but I know that'll change as the demand moves out. So.
Yeah,
You actually shouldn't see listings.
I know, no, it's terrible, but nobody's.
I was all like,
Yeah, no,
Iowa City and Marion both have that.
Yeah,
It's
but-
part of the code that
Right.
you can't
Craigslist
listen
and
to
the
these
rest.
stay
solely on the basis of
on Section 8.
Section
eight.
Yeah.
Yes,
do it for other reasons.
Right, but not based on your income source.
exactly.
All right, and that's all the time we have. So
Can I
thank you.
say
Or
one
go
thing, though?
Connors. Yeah.
What I would want to say is, while there may be similarities, I think we also have to be careful of the myths and misconceptions of the individuals that are accessing these units, because anywhere you go, there may be some crime, there may be some things that, we may not want to see, but by and large,